Selby Abbey is an Anglican parish church in the town of Selby, North Yorkshire, England. Monastic history. It is one of the relatively few surviving abbey churches of the medieval period, and, although not a cathedral, is one of the biggest. It was founded by Benedict of Auxerre in 1069 and subsequently built by the de Lacy family. On the 31st of May 1256, the abbey was bestowed with the grant of a mitre by Pope Alexander IV, and from this date was a mitred abbey. This privilege fell in abeyance a number of times, but on the 11th of April 1308, Archbishop William Greenfield confirmed the grant, and Selby remained a mitred abbey until the dissolution of the monasteries. Archbishop Walter Gifford visited the monastery in 1275 by commission, and several monks and the abbot were charged with a list of faults including loose living. In 1279 Archbishop William de Wickwayne made a visitation, and found fault with the abbot as he did not observe the rule of Saint Benedict, was not singing mass, preaching or teaching, and seldom attending chapter. Things had not improved much in 1306 when Archbishop William Greenfield visited, and similar visitations in later years resulted in similar findings. The community rebuilt the choir in the early 14th century, but in 1340, a fire destroyed the chapter house, dormitory, treasury and part of the church. The damage was repaired and the decorated windows in the south aisle of the nave were installed. In 1381 there was the abbot, and 25 monks. In 1393 Pope Boniface IX granted an indulgence to pilgrims who contributed to the conservation of the Chapel of the Holy Cross in the abbey. The 15th century saw more alterations to the abbey. The perpendicular windows in the north transept and at the west end of the nave were added, and the sedilia in the sanctuary was added. One of the final additions was the Latham Chapel, dedicated to St. Catherine, east of the north transept, in 1465. In the Valor Ecclesiasticus of 1535 the abbey was valued at £719 to s. 6¼ d. The abbey surrendered on 6 December 1539. The community comprised the abbot and 23 monks. The abbot was pensioned off on £100 a year, the prior got £8 and the others between £6 6s. 8d, and £5 each. Abbots of Selby: Benedict 1069 to 1097. Hugh de Lacy 1097 to 1123, Herbert 1123 to 1127, Durand 1127 to 1137, Interregnum 1137 to 1139, Walter 1139 to 1143, Helius Painel 1143 to 1153, German 1153 to 1160. Gilbert de Vere 1160 to 1184, Interregnum 1184 to 1189, Roger de London 1189 to 1195, Richard I 1195 to 1214, Alexander 1214 to 1221, Richard 1221 to 1223, Richard 1223. Hugh de Drayton 1245 to 1254, Thomas de Worley 1254 to 1263, David de Coed 1263 to 1269, Thomas de Worley 1270 to 1280, William de Ruslake B 1280-1293, John de Wistow I 1294 to 1300, William de Raslaby 1300 to 1313, Simon de Skardberg 1313 to 1321, John de Wistow II 1322 to 1335, John de Heslington 1335 to 1342, Geoffrey de Gadsby 1342 to 1368, John de Sherburne 1369 to 1408, William Pigott 1408 to 1429, John Cave 1429 to 1436, John Austhorpe 1436 to 1466, John Sharrow 1466 to 1486, Lawrence Selby, 1487–1504. Robert Deepinge, 1504–1518. Thomas Rawlinson, 1518–1522. John Barwick, 1522–1526. Robert Selby, 1526–1540. Post-monastic history. For a time after the dissolution, the church was unused, but in 1618 it became the parish church of Selby. During the English Civil War and the Commonwealth period, the building suffered, with the north transept window being destroyed, and the statues on the brackets in the choir were demolished. Like York Minster, the church rests on a base of sand and has suffered from subsidence. Many sections collapsed entirely during the 17th century, including the central tower in 1690, which destroyed the south transept. The tower was rebuilt, but not the transept. In the 18th century the choir was filled with galleries, and used for services, the nave only used for secular purposes. The church was restored by Sir George Gilbert Scott in 1871–1873, who restored much of the nave for use, and again in 1889–1890 by John Alderscott, who restored the choir. The tower was restored in the first few years of the 20th century. The fire of 1906. The organ builders from John Compton had been working until 11 p.m. on Friday the 19th of October, and shortly after midnight on Saturday the organist Frederick William Sykes spotted flames coming from the organ chamber. The organ builders had been installed a new kinetic gas engine to provide power to the new organ. Initial reports that the new organ equipment was to blame for the fire were later proved inaccurate. The fire destroyed the roof of the choir, and the belfry and peal of 8 bells was also destroyed. All of the interior fittings were also destroyed, but thanks to the actions of the local fire brigade, the 14th century stained glass in the east window was saved. A secondary fire broke out in the nave roof on the Sunday, but this was quickly extinguished. The abbey was rebuilt under the supervision of John Alderscott at a cost of around £50,000 and reopened in 1909. The restoration of the south transept was completed in 1912, funded by William Liversedge. Later 20th century, in 1935, the architect Charles Marriott Alderscott raised the height of the towers at the front. In 1969, Selby Abbey became the first parish church to hold the annual service for the distribution of the Royal Maundy. Restorations of 2002. The abbey is currently undergoing an extensive restoration, costing several £1 million. Stage 6. The restoration of the scriptorium was completed at a cost of £795,000. The £400,000 cost of restoring the south choir aisle and the Washington window was met in full by British American Tobacco. World Monuments Fund committed more than $800,000 to exterior work, including roof repairs, beginning in 2002. The Vicars of Selby. Anthony Ashton, 1540–1583. Robert Dove, 1583–1586. Thomas Tomlinson, 1586–1603. John Bradley, 1603–1610. Thomas Greenwood, 1610–1613. John Moore, 1613–1620. Richard Smith, bar 1620–1625. John Whitaker, bar 1625–1642. Paul Hamerton, 1642–1650. Richard Calvert, 1650–1658. Thomas Birdsall, 1658–1666. Arthur Squire, M.A. 1666–1698. Shadrich Sherburn, bar 1698–1701. Henry Allen, 1701. Geoffrey Rishton, 1701–1720. Thomas Hardy, 1720–1728. William Charnley, bar 1728–1748. Marmaduke Teasdale, bar 1748–1778. William Porter, M.A. 1778–1796. William Kyle, 1796–1797. Thomas Mounsey 1797–1819, Jonathan Muncaster 1819–1834, John Lear Walton M.A. 1834–1850, Francis Whaley Harper M.A. 1850–1889, Archibald George Tweedy M.A. 1889–1904, Morris Parkin M.A. 1904–1910, John Soloway D.D. 1910–1941, Alfred Edgar Moore Glover M.A. 1941–1945, Frank Reed A.K.C. 1945–1952, John Aldwyn Pelham Kent M.A. 1952–1978, Anthony Cecil Addison Smith M.A. 1978–1983, Michael William S. Dipt 1983–1990, Peter Lawrence MBE 1990–1993, James Alexander Robertson 1993–1996, Roy Ian John Matthews TDMA 1996–1997, Keith Michael Duke Spa 1997–2011, Canon John Wheatman 2011. Architecture. The tower is Norman, but the eastern end is in decorated Gothic style, and the west front a mixture of Norman, Gothic and Victorian. The interior bears some similarity to that of Durham Cathedral, on which the design was modelled. Richly carved and moulded capitals are found throughout the church. A major feature is the east window, which contains original medieval glass and depicts the Tree of Jesse, a popular subject of that period. The chancel stonework is thought to have been designed by Henri Everly. A notable feature of the abbey is the 15th-century Washington window, featuring the heraldic arms of the ancestors of George Washington, the first President of the United States. The design, featuring 3 red stars above 2 red bands on a white shield, is said to have been the model for the U.S. flag, and is the model for the flag of the District of Columbia. Organ. The first organ since the Reformation was installed in 1825 by Wren Boston, in a gallery on the east side of the choir screen wall. This organ was rebuilt several times by Booth of Wakefield, Forster and Andrews of Hull, and Conacher of Huddersfield. In 1868, the organ was rebuilt and moved to a bay in the choir. The opening recital was given by William Thomas Best. The organ was rebuilt in 1891 by James Jepson Binns of Bramley and moved again onto the north side of the choir. A rebuild took place by John Compton in 1906, but was soon afterwards destroyed by the fire. A new organ was built by William Hill dating from 1909, and 2 new organ cases were provided to designs by John Alderscott, either side of the choir. This organ has subsequently been restored by Hill, Norman and Beard in 1950. Opening recitals were given by Francis Jackson and Melville Cook. Following this rebuild, the noted Italian organist Fernando Germani made a series of LP recordings at the Abbey for HMV, which brought the organ to international attention. A further restoration took place by John T. Jackson in 1975. As of 2014, the organ is out of service awaiting a restoration. In 2002, Principal Pipe Organs provided a small chamber organ which is located in the chancel. Organists, this list is incomplete. You can help by expanding it. Mr. Wilkinson 1825–1832, Mr. Whitelock 1832, David Smallfit early 1840s, Mary Milnes 1854–1864, Wharton Hooper 1864–1866, William Riley 1866–1875, W.H. Smithson 1875–1878, Edward Johnson Bellaby 1878–1881, Frederick William Sykes 1881-1912-1919, Henry Oswald Hodgson 1919–1921, Herbert Hill 1921–1922, Walter Hartley 1922–1962, David Patrick Gedge 1962–1966, Mervyn John Byers 1966–1976. Peter Seymour 1976–1978. Dr. Anthony Langford 1978–1981. Mervyn John Byers 1980–1987. Geoffrey Pearce 1987–1994, previously organist and master of the choristers at St Andrew's Cathedral, Aberdeen from 1974. Roger Tedbert 1994. Bishop of Selby. The Bishop of Selby is a suffragan bishop to the Archbishop of York and oversees the Archdeaconry of York, which includes the Deanery of Selby. Selby Abbey is one of 20 members of the Greater Churches group.